Artists working in every medium, they love to push boundaries, whether through subversive works blurring the line between art and reality or challenging conventional norms. This creative audacity can yield truly memorable and influential pieces that leave a lasting impact on society. However, sometimes that vision just goes too far, doesn't it? Every once in a while, an artist's work deviates so significantly from public decency that it just gets completely banned. Yet, what is acceptable in one culture can be deeply offensive in another. Movies that might be considered too provocative for audiences in one country can just be perfectly acceptable elsewhere. Interestingly, not all film bans stem from content considered overtly objectionable. In some cases, movies have been prohibited for reasons that are as unusual as they are unexpected. Let's jump in. Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy are beloved characters created by the American writer and artist Johnny Gruelle in 1915. The original Raggedy Ann was made from a faceless rag doll that he painted for his daughter, and a few years later he wrote books featuring the character while also marketing dolls based on his original prototype. A couple of years later, he introduced Raggedy Andy as well, and the duo quickly became favorites among American children, a popularity that they continue to enjoy to this day. Never heard of them though. I'm British. Obviously, Kevin, who wrote this, is American. I guess he's more familiar with these Raggedy dolls. It was all a bunch of wholesome fun until the 1941 animated film Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy was released. Although the movie itself is pretty innocuous, it tells an amusing story. In the cartoon, a little girl visits a shop and wishes to buy the Raggedy Ann doll displayed in the window. However, the shopkeeper informs her that the two dolls have their hands stitched together and can only be sold as a pair. When the girl asks why, since she could only afford one doll, the shopkeeper then recounts the tale of their creation in Ragland. The movie follows the creation of the dolls, which are stitched together and painted by anthropomorphic tools before each is given a candy heart that brings it to life. Okay, next they set off for the name castle to be given names, but along the way Andy becomes distracted by a much prettier doll. As a result, Anne is sent to hospital because the rejection breaks her candy heart. Eventually, the two are reunited and walk down a wedding aisle while a crowd of onlookers shower them with rice. After crossing the aisle together, their hands are sewn together so that they can never be separated again. The movie concludes with the shopkeeper telling the girl that he couldn't sell one of the dolls separately, though there was nothing to stop him from giving her both as a present. It's not really a very good movie, but it was the sort of generic trope that likely resonated with children of the 1940s. I got kids. This would resonate with my kids. They'd like it, and I'd be like, why? Why'd you like this? So, what was the problem? Why was the movie immediately pulled from theaters and shelved after its initial release? Well, the issue was that the screenwriter hadn't actually read the source material, since Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy were famously brother and sister, not husband and wife. Given that all the children who watched it would have known this fact, there was a concern that the incestuous nature of the plot might be too damaging to their fragile little minds. It was considered such a disaster that not only was the film pulled, but Raggedy Andy didn't appear in cartoon for another 36 years to avoid any accidental mishaps like this again. How do you get this so extraordinarily wrong, film studios? For anyone who has seen the movie A Clockwork Orange, indeed I have, it's no surprise that at least one country felt compelled to ban the film entirely. Yeah, because it's a really intense movie. The movie's official tagline, which appears on posters worldwide, was "Being the adventures of a young man whose principal interests are rap, ultra-violence, and Beethoven." That promise is one the film does fully deliver, much to the ire of governments around the globe. A Clockwork Orange stars Malcolm McDowell as Alex, a violent teenage sociopath intended to embody pure evil. Convicted of murder, Alex is sentenced to 14 years in prison, but he is offered the alternative of participating in a psychological experiment designed to correct his behavior. The film portrays this method of behavioral conditioning as torturous and raises the question of whether it is justified to condition someone to conform to society's rules or when compliance is involuntary, even if their inner thoughts remain violent and corrupt. The movie was originally released in the United States and the UK, but many countries refused to show a film with such graphic depictions of violence. Ireland banned A Clockwork Orange in 1973, and it wasn't finally shown in theaters there until the year 2000. Even then, the promotional posters had to be changed, as the original tagline was deemed too offensive and included words that were considered inappropriate for advertisement. Singapore didn't lift their ban on the movie until 2011, and even then it was restricted to audiences over the age of 21. Brazil initially imposed an outright ban for a few years, and when the film was finally released there, it was only permitted to be shown with the nudity censored. The movie also was banned in South Africa, South Korea, Malta, and parts of Canada. When South Africa eventually allowed screenings of A Clockwork Orange, the viewing was again restricted to audiences aged 21 or older, and only an edited version of the movie was ever shown. However, while many governments banned the movie because of its content, it was also pulled from theatres in the UK at the personal request of director Stanley Kubrick. Although British censors were apparently fine with the film, Kubrick wanted it removed after reports surfaced of moviegoers imitating acts of violence against innocent civilians. The UK, everybody. The 1987 West German film Necroantic might come across as if it was intended as a dark comedy, but that impression largely stems from the restrictions on what can be discussed on YouTube. The film features Robert and Betty, a couple united by a shared interest in what we'll call unconventional amorous activities. Robert worked for a street cleaning company that specialized in tidying up after car crashes and other fatal accidents. One day, he brought home a corpse from work as a gift for Betty, a present she enjoyed in every way imaginable and in several ways that are best left undescribed. Oh my god, I'm glad I haven't seen this film. Anyway, Robert ended up getting fired from his job, and at that point, Betty decided he was of no use to her, so she left him to go be with the corpse instead. Robert didn't take this well. He eventually ended up murdering his pets and a couple of humans before ultimately taking his own life. The movie then concluded with Betty digging up Robert's f***ing grave. Thanks to its graphic depictions of necrophilia, Necroantic was banned in Iceland, Malaysia, Singapore, parts of Canada, Finland, New Zealand, Australia. The list just keeps on going. I'm not going to read it all. The movie was also banned and seized in West Germany because it had been made in defiance of their censorship laws and was secretly distributed through outlets like mail-order catalogs. Interestingly enough, despite the West German government actively pursuing prosecution against anyone distributing this movie, it apparently remains popular enough to justify a sequel, with Betty and the corpse of Robert both reprising their roles from the original movie. Titikut Follies holds the special distinction of being the first movie ever banned in the United States for reasons other than obscenity, immorality, or national security, with the latter generally referring to the banning of foreign propaganda films. The movie was the first documentary made by lawyer-turned-documentarian Frederick Wiseman, focusing on the treatment of patients at the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane in Massachusetts. Its title was inspired by the hospital staff's talent show, with Titikut serving as the Native American name for a nearby river. Throughout the film, the documentarians made every effort to refrain from interfering with the hospital's daily operations. Instead, the movie serves as a raw look at the human rights abuses committed against patients by the staff, as well as the overall deplorable conditions in which they were forced to live. Intended as an expose of the hospital, the film saw very few viewers when it was first released in 1967. Titikut Follies was set to debut at the New York Film Festival, but before the event could take place, the Massachusetts state government took legal action to block the screening. They argued that the film violated the privacy rights of the hospital patients, despite the documentary having been made with their permission. Wiseman had obtained consent from either every individual involved in the film or regarding several of the patients from the hospital's superintendent, who served as their legal guardian. Given that the movie was created to reveal how staff abused the patients, it's noteworthy that every hospital employee agreed to sign releases allowing their appearance. However, Massachusetts maintained the permission from the patient's legal guardian was not a valid substitute for releases signed by the patients themselves. A New York court allowed the movie to be shown at the festival, but a Massachusetts court subsequently ordered all copies of the documentary to be confiscated and destroyed. The case was then appealed to the state Supreme Court, which upheld that the movie could not be released to the public, but could be shown to doctors, lawyers, social workers, and other professionals in healthcare or related fields. The movie remained banned throughout the United States for decades. However, in 1987, families of 7 inmates who died in the hospital sued to have the movie released, arguing that their loved ones might not have died at the hands of cruel mistreatment by the staff if people had been given the opportunity to see the movie. In 1991, the Massachusetts Supreme Court finally ruled that the movie could be released, as the privacy concerns were no longer particularly relevant now that most of the people involved in the documentary were dead. He did, however, add that the film should include a brief update on any changes and improvements that had taken place at the hospital since it was originally filmed back in 1966. Back in the mid to late 2000s, a surprising number of people believed that the world was going to end in 2012. This belief was based on the fact that 2012 marked the end of the Mayan calendar, even though a more logical assumption might be that whoever created the original calendar simply got bored or ran out of paper. instead of them predicting the end of the world. The popularity of this theory became even more puzzling when the Mayans themselves made it clear that they absolutely did not believe that the world was going to end in 2012. But I mean, when have logic or reason ever stood in the way of a good disaster movie? In the case of the 2009 film 2012, logic took a backseat to entertainment in what turned out to be a barely adequate disaster movie. The plot was pretty straightforward. The world was set to end in 2012, as the Mayans had predicted, through a series of natural disasters, and John Cusack had to try and save his family from certain doom. Oh, this is the movie with all those big boats, right? There was also an element of political and wealthy elite villainizing others, as they do, but mostly the film served as an excuse to head to the theater and watch Los Angeles be destroyed. Now, you might assume that North Korea and Kim Jong-il would have wholeheartedly embraced a movie depicting the complete destruction of the United States. However, this film was actually banned in the country. Admittedly, nearly every Western or South Korean movie is banned by default in North Korea unless a film receives explicit approval, but nevertheless, certain movies, such as 2012, received explicit bans in addition to the blanket ban. So, why was North Korea so incensed about a film that depicted the destruction of the United States? Well, the issue was less about the film's content and more about the year in which the movie was set. North Korea has been described as a necrocracy, a government ruled by the dead. In this case, both the country's founder, Kim Il-sung, and the previous leader, Kim Jong-il, are regarded as eternal leaders. Despite having been dead for decades, Kim Il-sung remains the eternal president of North Korea, and 2012 would have marked his 100th birthday. This milestone was meant to be a special time, with 2012 envisioned as the year North Korea ascended to global superpower status. Consequently, a movie portraying... How'd that go, North Korea? Consequently, a movie portraying the complete annihilation of humanity in 2012 ran directly counter to the North Korean government's beliefs. In North Korea, bootlegging Western media is considered a serious crime, and possessing a bootleg copy of 2012 in particular has been labeled, quote, a grave provocation against the development of the state, reportedly carrying a prison sentence of up to 5 years. There are also accounts of individuals being executed for bootlegging American movies in North Korea, though none of these cases have been definitively linked to 2012. While such stringent government censorship would typically be seen as highly negative, in the case of this particular film going public, not very much was lost. This final entry wasn't banned nationwide in any country, but it did face a ban in Memphis, Tennessee, for perhaps the most ridiculous reason imaginable. Many of you might be familiar with the 1985 movie Brewster's Millions, starring Richard Pryor as Montgomery Brewster. However, that film was actually the 5th adaptation of the original 1902 story. The version that became controversial in Tennessee was the 1945 film featuring Dennis O'Keefe as Montague L. Brewster. The basic plots of the various adaptations remain the same, although the specific dollar amounts and a few minor details have changed over the years. In the 1945 version, Montague returns from World War II to find out that he's inherited $8 million from a deceased uncle. However, he initially receives only $1 million and must spend every single penny within 2 months without acquiring any material goods or financial assets. If he succeeds, he will then receive the remainder of the inheritance. Additionally, he's not allowed to disclose any details of the will stipulations to anyone. Doing so would result in forfeiting the money. Now, if you're wondering why somebody would include such a bizarre clause in their will, even in a fictional setting, the theory was that by forcing Montague to spend all of this money at once, he would quickly tire of spending and thus become more responsible with the rest of his own inheritance. While one could easily argue that this plan demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature, it was meant as a comedy, so just don't worry too much about it. All of this, though, raises the question of why Memphis took such an exception to the 1945 remake of the story. The original book was popular, as was the Broadway play and the 3 previous film adaptations. What could have changed in this version that made it so objectionable? Well, according to the Memphis Board of Motion Picture Censors, the movie wasn't racist enough. Although it featured a black servant character played by Eddie Rochester Anderson, Memphis believed that the character wasn't subservient enough and had, quote, too familiar a way about him. Officials argued that the film was dangerous to the public welfare and could incite race riots because there was simply, quote, too much social equality and racial mixture for Southern audiences to tolerate. This occurred despite the fact that Eddie's character remained very much a servant, not an equal to Montague. In many ways, the decision to ban the movie in Memphis revealed more about the prejudices of Southern audiences than about the movie itself. Thank you for watching.